Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. My name is Jonathan Schanzer. I am Senior Vice President for Research here, and it is terrific to see so many familiar faces here in the room. We are looking forward to our timely event this morning as we address the Syrian impasse. What is Turkey's endgame in the Afrin campaign, and how does this impact Washington's policy? We're lucky to have some of the foremost experts in the field here with us today to speak to these issues. I will keep it short so that we can jump right in. Just first, a few housekeeping items. Today's event is being live streamed. It is being video recorded. It is also being broadcast on C-SPAN. So I encourage guests in the audience, in attendance and viewing at home, to join in on the conversation via Twitter at FDD. Please feel free to comment as we go along, and we'll try to address those comments. This is the time where I ask you to set your cell phones to stun. We certainly don't want our guests to be interrupted as they engage in this conversation. And now I am very pleased to hand over the conversation to my colleague, a research analyst here at FDD, Merve Tahiroglu. This is actually her first moderated event, so we're very pleased to have you do this. And take it away, Merve.
Thank you, John, for that speech and that. And thank you all for coming to this panel. So roughly 3 weeks ago, the Turkish army launched an operation across the border in northern Syria into a region called Afrin. Turkey is there fighting the group YPG, which is also the U.S.'s partner in Syria, fighting ISIS. This is on, right?
Bit low, your voice.
It's not working. Oh, there we go. Can anybody hear me? Yes. Okay, good. Okay, so Turkey is there in Afrin fighting the group YPG, and yet YPG is partnered with the United States elsewhere in Syria in the fight against ISIS, so this causes all sorts of complications for Turkey, U.S., and U.S. policy in Syria in general. So we have three great panelists here with us today to talk about this. I'm going to briefly introduce them. Aliza Marcus is the author of Blood and Belief, the PKK and the Kurdish Fight for Independence. She's a well-known expert on the Kurdish national movement. Then we have Gonul Tol. She's the director of the Middle East Institute Center for Turkish Studies, and she also serves as an adjunct professor at GW here in DC. And then we have Amberin Zaman, one of the best journalists from Turkey, who currently writes for the Al-Monitor in English and also in the Turkish media outlet Diken. I strongly encourage to follow her if you don't already on all these outlets. With that, I want to start the conversation. Aliza, I want to first ask you a question, because part of the problem with the Afrin operation and what we've been hearing here is that Turkey says that it's in Afrin fighting the YPG because the YPG poses the number one top security threat, even an existential threat to Turkey. And it's saying that because the YPG is an offshoot of the PKK, which is a Kurdish insurgency group that has been fighting inside Turkey, the Turkish state, for the last 3.5 decades. So you know the Kurdish movement really well, and you know northern Syria, the Kurdish movement in Syria, as well as the PKK. And given the discord here between Turkey saying that the PKK and YPG are one and the same, therefore any American cooperation with the YPG amounts to cooperation with the PKK, and yet the United States has over the last few years insisted that they're different enough that it can keep working with the YPG in Syria against ISIS, and also tell Turkey that it will aid Turkey's fight against the PKK. So this is a very complex picture, and it puts a conundrum for the Kurds and for the Turks and for the Americans all over the place. And I was hoping you might be able to walk us through.
Right, that's a great question, one of the basic questions. And of course, everything you said can exist and be true, and at the same time be somewhat nuanced simultaneously. So let's just look first at the PYD and YPG, or what, given all the different acronyms, what we could say is the dominant, just call it the dominant Kurdish organization in Syria right now. Clearly, and this is something that, if you go back into the PKK's own literature and talk to them, the PYD was formed as a subsidiary, as an affiliate of the PKK. When it was formed, the idea was that the PKK was no longer going to be the sole vanguard of the Kurdish movement in the region, but that each part of the Kurdish region would have its own party that would operate to bring Kurds all democracy, autonomy, gender freedom, and other things along Öcalan's lines, but they were part of the PKK nonetheless. I think what's an important distinction, and what the U.S. is obviously focused on, is the fact that in Syria, the PYD, YPG, this dominant player, operates according to the specific conditions of Syria. They have autonomy in their decision-making processes. They make their decisions based on what's good at the moment. They train their people in Syria. They're focused on Syria. So I don't think that all this is, really, obviously this nuance is not of great interest to Turkey, but nonetheless it is important when looking at the PYD and YPG. At the same time, the operations of this organization in Syria have not been counter in a military way against Turkey. There haven't been attacks on Turkey from Syrian territory. They've tried to keep, over the past few years, their senior commanders in Syria. So, the problem is for the United States, I'm sure we'll get into this later on, is that by denying any link between the two, something that's necessary for U.S. policy, they also make it difficult for the U.S. to acknowledge some of Turkey's concerns and try to explain why the YPG is not a real threat. Not that that would necessarily calm the situation. But so there are clearly links, but when we look at the YPG and PYD, we see that they are operating according to Syrian conditions for the situation in Syria.
Well, thank you for that, and I should also note that there's a legal distinction between them too. The United States lists the PKK as a terrorist organization, right. So there's that little nuance right. there, which I'm sure we can get into in the rest of the conversation. But okay, well, let me turn to just Gonul for a minute here, because this is very much a war. Turkey is at a state of war here. It's the second operation it's carrying out in Syria, but it feels different already. First of all, Turkey is under a state of emergency at this time. There's that, but also the restrictions on the media and on civil society is growing and is fierce. And I think already more than 500 people have been arrested in Turkey for speaking out against the war in Afrin. So what is the view in Turkey, and what are the Turkish government's objectives here with this offensive in Afrin?
Well, I think a large segment of Turkish society is behind the operation, and that explains, I think, the main driver of Turkey's military incursion, and that's the domestic politics. After the referendum, I think the referendum results exposed Erdogan's vulnerability. And he wants to boost his popularity ahead of elections, presidential elections. So he wanted to tap into the anti-Kurdish, the very strong anti-Kurdish and anti-American sentiment in the country. And the opposition, except for the pro-Kurdish HDP, is behind, supported the operation. And I'm not sure about the exact numbers, but I believe around 80% of, according to recent public opinion polls, 80% of Turkish society supports the Afrin operation. So I think the main driver was domestic politics. And those two dynamics, that anti-Kurdish and anti-American sentiments, they are very important, and they feed each other. They've always been there, but I think, and we can talk about in detail, but I think there are new dynamics in terms of Turkey's anti-Americanism and the anti-Kurdish sentiment. So he wants to tap into those and basically boost his popularity. So one thing. Because I think the Afrin operation is as much against the Kurds as it is against the U.S. That is the government's narrative. So the proclaimed aim was to break the cooperation between the US and the YPG, and the US repeatedly said that it had nothing to do with the YPG in Afrin, but the domestic narrative is that we are there to disrupt this relationship between the US and the YPG. So I think that makes the situation very complicated, and I'm sure Amberin will touch on the complications of the operation on the ground. But domestically too, if you look at it from the Turkish-US perspective, I think the anti-Americanism that we're seeing now is different in that it's much more widespread. There's always been anti-Americanism in Turkey, but what we're seeing now is that the AKP, the former Islamists, the Kemalists, the military, the leftists, they've all found common ground in something, and that is the anti-Kurdish and anti-Americanism, and that's what makes it difficult to resolve the tension between Turkey and the US, and I think that's also a recipe for disaster, because I think Turkey has long lost its strategic direction in foreign policy, and that domestic concerns became the backbone of Turkish foreign policy making.
Yeah, just as a follow-up with that, thank you. I think that was hugely explanatory from Turkey's point of view. But I wonder, why is this operation taking place now? Is there a reason for that Erdogan needs to consolidate this nationalism and anti-Americanism and anti-Kurdish sentiment that is widespread in Turkey? Because the war is helping consolidate that, as you explained, and I'm curious if you think there are specific reasons why you might be doing that now.
Well, because the elections are coming up, and some even talk about the possibility that Erdogan might call for early elections in 2018. So I think that explains the timing of the operation. Turkey, but also there are other factors as well. Turkey has been threatening a military operation against Afrin for over a year now. But until now, it has been delayed mainly because Russians were unwilling to allow such an operation. They have troops in Afrin, and they control the skies over Afrin. And I think what prompted Russian green light was the U.S. decision to stay longer in Syria, and that is something that makes the regime, Iranians, and the Russians really nervous. So I think this was part of Russian strategy to both weaken the YPG and so indirectly curb U.S. influence in a post-conflict Syria, and also signal to the Kurds that in fact Russians call the shots, and caution them against closer ties with the United States. So I think this is what Russia had in mind. And the regime in Iran unwillingly, although Iran recently urged Turkey to stop the operation. But for them, again, it's nerve-wracking to hear from U.S. officials that America is willing to stay longer and will work closely with the YPG. So I think the timing is something to do both with domestic dynamics, that is the elections, and also Russian concerns and Russian change in Russian strategy.
Right, thank you. And just to explain to those of you who may not know Turkish politics very well, that by election we're referring to the upcoming presidential election. That will be the first election before the new constitution will take effect in Turkey, which gives Erdogan more powers, and it'll make it more of a legal case. But yes, I want to get into some of the geopolitical concerns that you mentioned. The U.S. policy, I mean, we have now Mattis and Tillerson are headed to Turkey. They're going to be having talks with their Turkish counterparts. I'm curious, Turkey's operation in Afrin, there hasn't been a strong condemnation from the United States, or even concern that has been voiced about this operation, but the U.S. is working with the YPG and more broadly with this group SDF in Syria, and it has recently indicated that it is planning in the post-ISIS world to have a longer presence there, but its only allies there are the SDF, which are primarily made up of the YPG. So does this pose a conundrum for U.S. policy in Syria? Amberin, I wanted to ask you that, and also how the YPG is reacting to this.
Well, first of all, I think the United States has actually registered quite a bit of concern, and we've heard that from the State Department. We heard that in the Trump phone call with Erdogan, that he articulated concern about this operation and how it might be undermining the anti-ISIS campaign elsewhere in Syria, and also concern articulated about the high civilian casualties, and these are obviously mounting as the operation continues. So yes, the United States is very concerned, but at the same time it also says that, you know, they're not present in Afrin. Afrin is not part of their zone of influence, as it were, so they're not really in a position to intervene. The Kurds, of course, disagree with that view, and they feel that the United States should be doing much more to end this campaign. And the fact that the United States, on the one hand, expresses concern, but has not actually said stop, of course, has sharpened Kurdish anxieties about the commitment of the United States to their security. As for the United States saying, well, Secretary Tillerson laid it out at Stanford recently, that they're going to be staying on for a number of reasons, and my colleagues just ran through some of them. I think saying that, but actually not, matching that with any real action, and particularly set against what we just witnessed in Iraqi Kurdistan, which seems to fly in the face of U.S. claims of wanting to counter Iranian influence, of course, again raises questions in Kurdish minds and actually puts them in a very difficult position, because by presenting them as allies against Iran, against the regime, talking about regime change without committing the resources to doing any of that, really makes the Kurds extremely vulnerable. And as Gonul pointed out, in fact, we're not just talking anymore about Turkish and US conflict of interest here, but increasingly one of the Russians and the Americans sort of, with sort of, I guess, beginning to knock their heads against each other as, the battle lines draw closer and closer, particularly in that area, Deir ez-Zor. So, yeah, it's getting extremely sticky. And I think that the Russians are playing a sort of finely calibrated game of sort of, turning the tap on and off with the Turks. And unfortunately, what we're beginning to witness, as Gonul said, as Aliza already said, is that the more the Kurds are perceived as allies of the United States, and part of this alleged effort to get rid of Assad to counter Iranian influence, we'll be seeing more and more of the Russians, I think, allowing this kind of more Turkish aggression against the YPG.
Right. One of the sort of reports that came out of the SDF when Turkey's operation began was that they said that they believe that this was happening because Russia had offered the YPG in Afrin to strike a deal with Assad for local autonomy, and that they had rejected it. This statement, I believe, came from the SDF, but it was in reference to the YPG in Afrin. So it looks like Russia might be trying to maybe split the Kurdish movement in Syria between the Russian zone and the
Well, I think
American.
the Russians are trying to do several things at the same time. On the one hand, they'd like to see the regime reestablish control, and I think this whole Afrin thing is part of that, and we've seen it happen already before in that area, but not on this scale, obviously, with Russia sort of dangling the Turkish bogeyman before the Kurds and saying, look, if you don't let the regime, set up here, well, the Turks are going to come. And, so this is a replay of that, but on a far bigger scale. But I think we also tend to underestimate the degree to which the Russia's relations with Turkey in Syria also driven by Russia's own security concerns. the presence of all these fighters from the Caucasus, these radicalized fighters, and the fact that throughout the 2000s and in the 90s, these people found a haven in Turkey. And so, I think it's incredibly important for Russia to be able to cooperate with Turkey to try and contain this threat. So there is that aspect of this, which in turn puts Russia at odds with the regime and with Iran, because I don't believe that either the regime or Iran are terribly happy about this Turkish incursion into Afrin and the fact that they're moving further south into the de-escalation zones in Idlib, because from the regime's point of view, that's Turkey parking itself even further into its territory with the help of the rebels, which Turkey initially allied itself with to overthrow this regime. So it's getting incredibly complicated.
And if I might add, also for Russia, I think it's important to keep Turkey part of the Astana process as well, to make the entire process more legitimate. So that's why Turkish security concerns, to a certain degree, it is important for Russia.
Yes, but is it important for Russia to have any representatives from the Kurdish movement, do you think? Or is it more important to have Turkey representative? Because in the last round of meetings after Turkey started the operation into Afrin, there was a bit of talk between whether the Kurds were going to get invited to the next round of talks and whether they were not. And at the end of it, after Turkey's operation began, the conclusion was that they weren't invited. So it seemed like Turkey bargained something there, or doesn't it?
Well, they didn't attend as under the PYD umbrella, but I've heard from journalists who were there in Sochi that the people who were close to the PYD were there. So I think at the end of the day, I think Russia would like to see them at the table, because they don't see it realistic not to include the PYD in the political process. So they will be there, and I don't know what the essence of the deal, what the deal was, the cut between Russia and Turkey before Turkey went ahead with the Afrin operation. So maybe the understanding was that the Russians would give a green light to a limited Turkish incursion into Afrin and return, and that would boost Erdogan's popularity, so he could swallow the fact that the PYD is represented at the political process. So could be that.
I mean, certainly the PYD had hoped to be sort of formally there, I think, and this came. It seems it came as somewhat as a shock to them. I mean, they've said afterwards, we don't want to take part given what's happening with Turkey and Afrin, but I think they have always sort of seen Russia as being a little more accommodating as opposed to the U.S., which has never wanted to bring them in as a formal partner, despite support for the YPG.
Well, if we are to assume that either both the United States and Russia are planning for some sort of a settlement to this now 7-year conflict of the Syrian civil war, and if they're both planning for this future post-ISIS, how do we settle the question of the Syrian civil war situation? Both of these actors are going to think that, including the Kurds, in some sort of a settlement is absolutely necessary. So, Aliza, let me just ask you about the PYD's relationship with the United States and Kurds, both in light of this, but also historically and since the beginning of the Syrian civil war. And I'm curious what kind of a settlement do you think would best accommodate the PYD's interests?
Well, first of all, I'm not as optimistic as you are that there's plans for a real settlement of what's happening in Syria.
So, didn't say I'm optimistic.
Okay. Well, then let me just put it out. I'm not optimistic, if that was the question. I think, look, the PYD, the YPG, and its various federative structures that it's trying to form, they've made very clear that they want, in some form or another, to be able to control their territory. They talk in very big terms about democracy and gender equality and things like that, and certainly they have gone, compared with other groups and countries in the region, they've done quite well on some of these, on certainly the gender equality. They would like to see that. Now, whether they're going to get that is difficult, but I think at the end of the day, this is something they're going to demand. This is something that they would not back down very easily from. They don't want to see their institutions disbanded. They don't want to see their military force disbanded. they see this as their final protection. And the events in Afrin and the sort of the U.S. kind of inability to take a clear stand on this and stand up for the Kurds only is another message to the Kurdish movement that it ultimately needs to rely on itself, that it can't rely on other countries to protect its security. Now, the thing is, of course, that the Kurds, the control of the territory of Rojava depends quite a bit on American support. And, if it came to a decision of the U.S. to withdraw that support, there are many different areas where battles could break out. So it's important for the Kurds to try to maintain this, obviously, and keep the U.S. behind them. So. But for the Kurds in Syria and for the PKK as well, and Kurds in Turkey, what's happening in Rojava is very important at a time when the PKK has been squeezed inside Turkey, when operations, both the political movement in Turkey and the military movement, Kurdish movement in Turkey, has been really put under pressure. Politicians arrested, the municipalities taken over, and pretty much any sort of Kurdish, or for that matter, many democratic expressions seen as a crime now and reason to be detained. The PKK needs to show a gain. And the gain it has is what's happening in Rojava. And Rojava for the PKK sort of can explain away some of its inability to operate in Turkey right now. In fact, if you recall, in 2015, the PKK launched a sort of war in the cities in southeast Turkey, and this led to a Turkish counterattack that pretty much leveled large parts of different cities in southeast Turkey and led to a number of deaths. In the PKK's sort of way of explaining this, it says, well, we had to have this war there because we were concerned that there was going to be a Turkish operation against Rojava, and it was an attempt to turn attention away. So the PKK at this time really needs Rojava too, and I think they will. They see this as their subsidiary there is a critical part of the group's overall success regionally and specifically in Turkey. But having said that, I want to emphasize again that the movement in Syria has not posed an actual armed threat to Turkey. I mean, the Afrin operation was not preceded by attacks by YPG against Turkey. And in fact, Turkey has constructed a huge wall now along the sort of eastern part of the border with Syria, making it even more difficult for there to be attacks. But nonetheless, obviously, the fact that the YPG is an affiliate of the PKK is of great concern for Turkey to have this on its border.
Well, yeah, I mean, you just harkened back to a couple of years ago, and I want to do the same because Turkey's relationship with the PKK has changed over the years as well, and Turkey's relationship with YPG and PYD have changed as well in relation to one another. And just a few years ago, Turkey was still in a peace process with the PKK, and as you mentioned that from the PKK's point of view, the fear that Turkey would attack northern Syria or Rojava, from Turkey's point of view, the statements have been indicating that Turkey has been quite unnerved for some years, since 2012 now, that the Kurds in northern Syria along the Turkish border have been gaining more and more international support and self-rule. So they view the rise of Kurdish politics in Syria as a threat as well. And has that affected, in Gönül and Amberin's, both of your opinions, I would really be curious to hear, has that affected Turkey's calculations in terms of its peace process with the PKK, or were there other domestic considerations as well with that?
Is it? Okay. Absolutely, yes. I think that the whole, in fact, Arab Spring came at a very unfortunate time in that respect. And just as Turkey had sort of relaunched this peace process with Abdullah Öcalan, you saw the Kurds gaining ground, and as of 2014 with the assistance of the United States. And I think that really freaked out the Turkish government. I think regardless of who would have been in power, we keep talking about Erdogan, but I think this is, a typical reaction, knee-jerk reaction of the Turkish state whenever they see Kurds gaining influence, certainly across their borders, and particularly with the help of, perceived help of the West, this takes them straight back to sever, and so it's total panic, and the immediate sort of goal is to suppress that. And I think part of what went on during those talks with Abdullah Öcalan was a set of demands made by Turkey that were, I think, frankly, impossible for the PKK/YPG to accept, including throwing its full support for regime change, in support of regime change, alongside the rebels, withdrawing completely from Turkey, and the sort of PKK becoming the YPG, which in turn became part of the anti-Assad force. And throughout that process, while those talks were ongoing, we did not see a single constitutional reform passed that would have, instilled any degree of confidence on the Kurdish side, encouraging them to think that, whatever they did, would actually yield any concrete results in terms of fulfilling their, long-running demands for greater, political autonomy, etc. So, yeah, is the short answer to your question.
And also, I think what happened in Syria, the Syrian conflict and the rise of the YPG and the US-YPG partnership, I think it also transformed the AKP's nationalism. I don't think that was the only factor, but it was a huge factor in changing Turkish nationalism. In a way, for instance, when the AKP first came to power in 2002, they embraced something that some scholars called Muslim nationalism. And Muslim nationalism was different than Kemalist nationalism in that it paid less attention to ethnic identity. And the Muslim identity was the main marker of Turkishness in AKP's ideology. So that's why I think that partly explains why Erdogan embraced, and I'm not saying that this was the only factor, I want to underline that, but partly explains why he embraced or launched Kurdish opening. So he had a different mindset. And at the time, in 2003, right after American invasion of Iraq, we had the Kemalists and the military that were very anti-American. And the AKP was the only actor that promoted a pro-Western identity. So they criticized Kemalists for being defensive nationalists and inward-looking. And they had a different outlook. They had a different vision. But now they're all on the same page. So Kemalist nationalism is back, and that's never good news for the Kurds. And I think, so what happened in Syria and the rise of the YPG had a lasting impact in Turkish politics. So I think that anti-Americanism and the anti-Kurdish sentiment might not be something contextual that we can only explain with what the US is doing with the YPG, what the YPG is doing in northern Syria. So I think that is concerning.
Well, there's also, you all mentioned the HDP, the predominantly Kurdish political party in Turkey, the second largest opposition party in parliament. Both of whose co-chairs are in jail and have been in jail. And that summer, when Turkey's, the government's peace talks with the PKK failed, also that summer we had an election where HDP had gotten 13% in the election. So, and this is, a year and a half after the Americans first cooperated with the YPG there in Syria because of Kobani, and so this was after that, and so the Turkish society and the government weren't really as nationalist as you described it right now. So was there the HDP factor there, do you think?
Well, I think, I don't think HDP became the victim of it. But for Erdogan, other than what happened in Syria, there are also, again, domestic electoral considerations. But I think the HDP has become a non-actor since 2015. So I don't think it played a role in that transformation.
I see. Well,
And it was just impacted by that transformation.
Well, I guess there's sort of like the conundrum for, you know, this argument that, well, for Erdogan if he were to have continued with the peace process with Abdullah Öcalan in 2015, that, you know, maybe he could have gained support somehow electorally. But of course, ironically, it actually hurt him electorally because it strengthened the HDP and maybe strengthened nationalist opposition to what he was doing. So he was sort of in a break. But I agree. I don't think that this is key. The decisions Erdogan was making were indexed solely to any elections or votes. There are much bigger issues for him.
I agree with you. Plus, I would add, you know, we talk about elections in this incredibly optimistic sort of tone, presuming that they'll be free and fair. And I think the big question now before us is precisely that. Will they be? And so if we just judge by what unfolded during the referendum, the sort of irregularities, to put it politely, that were documented, you know, depending on how desperate Erdogan feels to hold on to power, you know, he may carry that sort of activity even further, to the extent where, you know, sort of winning Kurdish votes or nationalist votes or whatever won't really be that great a factor in his calculations, shall I say. So the future trajectory of Turkish politics, I think, will very much inform how Erdogan approaches the Kurdish issue as well.
right, and how do you think that, that was going to be one of my questions, but given where we are at now, how do you think that
I'm not terribly optimistic, I have to say. I mean, the only instance in which I could imagine a return to the peace process is one where Erdogan would regard it as being vital to his survival.
Right, okay. So with that, we have a good picture of where Turkey is at and the kind of complications this is posing for U.S. policy and Turkish-U.S. relations and Turkish-Kurdish relations, all over the place in Syria. I want to open to Q&A because I'm sure everybody has lots of questions about it. Can we take this one? Please stand up and wait for the mic, which is coming. And please introduce yourself.
Thank you. Ahmed Al-Hindi, I'm from the Syrian Democratic Council here in Washington, D.C. So a question, now we've seen all the Syrian groups allied with Turkey inside Syria. They show a lot of jihadi facade. We saw a lot of videos from them threatening the people of Afrin with a destiny similar to Torabora and Grozny in Chechnya. We saw them like destroying liquor stores. How the secular Turkish opposition viewing that? The groups that are allied with the secular Turkish army.
I would like to take that question. I would like to hear from all of you.
Shall we take two other and then answer? Or
let's do this round and then.
Well, if you criticize the Afrin operation, that I'll land you in jail in Turkey. So that's why I don't think there is a healthy debate at the moment. And the opposition, the CHP, and I can't call MHP an opposition party anymore, but an overwhelming majority of the country is behind the operation. So it means that they're not very concerned. Although, I mean, the CHP raised the question of who the people in the Free Syrian Army are. They don't look like, well, Erdogan called them national army, but they don't really look like a national army. So in the parliament, the CHP raised the question, but I don't think the majority of the country is buying that, and that hasn't really changed the perception and the support that the operation received.
Also, I think, first of all, yes, there are these videos of these people who appear to be, as you described, radical Islamists, but I'm not sure that everyone thinks that the Turkish public is convinced that all of these Free Syrian Army and other groups fighting alongside Turkish forces fit that description. And increasingly the narrative is that these people are shedding their blood to help defend Turkey. And so this is all happening for a greater cause. And also there's the other more cynical approach of, viewing these people as cannon fodder, sadly. And we haven't heard any casualty figures for these groups fighting alongside Turkey, which I find quite dehumanizing and rather tragic. And I think, sort of caricaturizing those people, sort of, attaching labels to them in that way doesn't serve any useful purpose, frankly.
And it's also costing. It's hurting their cause. I mean, the Free Syrian Army is fighting Turkey's war, and I believe that in Afrin, probably whatever Turkey and the Turkey-backed forces capture in Afrin will be handed over to the regime. So imagine the awkward situation that would put the Free Syrian Army in. They will be fighting and dying for that territory, and then eventually they will be handed over to the regime. So I think Turkey is hurting the Free Syrian Army's cause too.
All right, we'll take another question from the front. Please also state your affiliation.
Lori Milroy, Kurdistan 24. Given what you've described about the seriousness with which Erdogan is pursuing the YPG in Syria and how it's linked to domestic politics and how important it is to him, what do you think the chances are for a clash between Turkey and the United States over Manbij? Is that a remote possibility or is that a real possibility?
Well, Erdogan boxed himself in because he said that so many times publicly that after Afrin, Turkey would target Manbij next. It's going to be very difficult for him to walk back. But of course, as we mentioned earlier, Secretary Tillerson will be holding talks with Turkish officials, and McMaster will too. But for Turkey to walk back, it has to get something tangible from the US. And I don't know what that is. I know early on, right after the Turkish military incursion, Secretary Tillerson talked about a security zone. I wasn't clear about what he was thinking because I've heard in the Turkish media that he offered a security zone in Afrin. It's not the US's call, it's the Russians. So US cannot promise anything there. So the only thing that the US can offer to make it easier for Erdogan to walk back is push the YPG, force the YPG to withdraw from Manbij. And that's very difficult. It's difficult because recently the US laid out its new strategy in Syria, so they want to stay there for stabilization and to play a role in the post-conflict Syria, and the YPG is the main ally. So they already, I think, hurt the feelings of the YPG when they said that Afrin is not our thing, it's not within our area of operation. So if they decide to hand over Manbij, if they push or ask the YPG to withdraw from Manbij, that will send the wrong signal to the Kurds. But of course the question is, do the Kurds have any other option? They are in a way desperate. But so I think it's what will Turkey do next? It's a very risky decision. If Erdogan decides to move into Manbij, that will be a breaking point, I believe, in Turkey-US relations. Will he do that? I mean, I argued that Incirlik is still open. And Incirlik Air Base, the US is using that air base to supply the YPG. So the more logical thing for Turkey was to close down Incirlik, and he didn't do that. So I want to assume that if he didn't do that, he won't go ahead and move into Manbij. But the other side of the argument is that he said this publicly so many times that it's going to be very difficult for him. So I guess we have to wait and see what American officials in visiting Ankara will offer.
Well, I agree with everything Gonul said, except that I do think it's possible for Erdogan to walk back his rhetoric. I think he can always switch this around. I mean, he controls the media, he controls the conversation there, and he can come up with a new sort of line of what is success. He has to show something. Most likely it would be something like setting up security outposts across the border in Afrin somehow. But I do think he can back away from that if he can come up with another gain that he can show, because he can rationalize it in a number of ways. He's very good at that.
But Manbij is, of course, a very particular case, because the United States promised Turkey that once Manbij was liberated, that the YPG would pull back and that the local administration would be removed from YPG influence, and that's not what happened. I was actually in Manbij myself back in September and had the opportunity to see some of that firsthand. But to answer your question about the possibility of a clash between Turkey and the United States, I don't believe that the United States would ever attack its NATO ally. And equally, I don't believe that Turkey would ever open fire on its NATO ally, the United States. I think that's almost inconceivable. And I think Manbij is rather more of a pink than a red line. And I think that the messaging we're seeing from the United States is more about don't do anything unilaterally. That's the message. Don't go, just do something without consulting us. That's what I'm taking away from this.
Thank you, and I just want to ask Gonul as well. Do you also think that that Turkey will never take that? Because there have been a number of threats coming from the Turkish government, from government officials, that they would strike at the Americans if they didn't leave.
Wear the YPG uniforms, yes, that they would treat them as terrorists.
You think they will? Okay.
I think it's possible, but on the other hand, I mean, Aliza, you're right. If you remember when Turkey launched the Euphrates Shield operation, they said the end game. Well, they would only withdraw. The operation would end after capturing Manbij, and they never did. And they said, well, we are successfully ending the operation. So you're right, but I think this context is different. Again, I mean, people are talking about early elections as early as this summer. So I think this is the key. What Turkey is doing in Syria is very important for Erdogan's domestic calculations. So it might be a more difficult context to walk back what he said. But, yeah.
Although it also depends, obviously, just with the military and its ability, what it sees as its sort of, and right now, Afrin has not proven to be a very simple operation for the Turkish military, and I think they'll be very aware of what they do not want to be ultimately humiliated on the battlefield.
That's true. Also, that's why I always argued that this is going to be a limited operation. A push into the outskirts of Afrin, but just this morning I read that in fact they are getting ready. Turkish military is getting ready to go into Afrin. I don't know if it's.
That would be very unwise.
Yes,
but Manbij is an Arab majority town. Let's not forget that.
And do you think that the YPG is prepared to, and the Americans are prepared to leave Manbij if it comes to that with Turkey?
I don't know. I think they'll be talking about that though, rather than killing each other.
Yes, well, we hope so. Thank you. I'll have to take a question from the back, very back, please. Also state your...
Thank you. As a Kurdish woman, for me, really, it is very difficult at the one hand to listen all these great geopolitical analyses, but I respect, but while the civilians are bombing still now by the Turkish F-16s, it is really difficult to listen all these great analyses. But for me, as Mr. Erdogan announced to the whole world, it is very simple. He's making an ethnic cleaning operation. So I just want to mention that. My question to all the participators are, what's your perspective that you as or all other great allies of the Kurds in the Nails, expecting from the Kurds in Rojava, in Syria, in Turkey, in Iran, what should Kurds do? What should their position to be stopped, to be subjecting, victimized, and killed? That's all. Thank you.
I'll probably just make that question a little bit also. Do you think that because of this operation that there might be a split within or a change within the Syrian Kurds' own relationship with the United States and given?
Well, I mean, first, yes, obviously civilians are being killed in Afrin, and that's one of the main reasons why people are so concerned and so horrified and saddened about what's going on there. But obviously, there's very little, in terms of what Kurds can do writ large. It's hard to say, and this is not about sort of Kurdish demonstrations in Germany or Kurds marching in Iraqi Kurdistan. This is about a lot of the other issues we've been talking about. So, unfortunately, I think there isn't any clear answer right now about this. And you look for the Syrian Kurds and for the PKK and for the YPG, maintaining the relationship with the United States is of critical importance. I mean, it's thanks to the United States that the Kurds were able to hold on to Kobane and then move out further from that. And then in turn, the Kurds were at the vanguard of defeating ISIS in that area. So both the Kurds and the U.S. need each other in that. And I don't see that the YPG would see any reason to change its position, its pro-American position, its position as being willing to be the lead fighters against ISIS and stop further infiltration. The question is, as Amberin raised, well, what sort of talks, what sort of negotiations will go on between them to try to diffuse possible situations? But the YPG has made very clear that it remains firmly on the side of the United States, despite what's happening in Afrin.
Wearing its SDF hat.
Sorry, yes, SDF.
Thank you. Okay, we'll have to, sir, can we also take that question? Thank you.
Hi, Stephen Flanagan from RAND. I have a question for Aliza Marcus, mainly, I think, on the relationship of the PYD and the YPG with the Iranian regime and the Iranian-backed militias that are operating in Syria. How do you assess those relationships? I think there's been some evidence of collaboration at different points, or at least tolerance, and even some suggestion that perhaps the Iranians had urged the Syrian regime to lay off a little bit in the northeast in the context of the conflict. And then just lastly, picking up on Gonul's just last comment about the U.S. access to Incirlik, I noticed that early on in the Afrin operation, Meryl Aksenar made some comment about, well, the first thing we should do is kick the Americans out of Incirlik. That seemed to die out. Was she a lone voice in that?
Well, first, obviously, with the relations between the Syrian Kurds, the PKK, and Iran have always been complicated and shifting. I mean, the PKK has a affiliate party, PJAK, that sometimes fights and sometimes doesn't fight, depending on what other issues are going on between the PKK and Iran and other countries in the region. So I think the situation, though, similar to how the U.S. has been able to kind of separate the PKK from the YPG, the PKK is struggling to separate its own whatever ongoing dialogue it has with Iran on and off. Like I just want to add, like all powers in that region have with Tehran and its goals in Rojava with whatever demands or interests of Iran. I mean, that is one thing that the Kurdish movement has always been very good at, sort of putting its own interests first to a certain extent and trying to stay focused on what its goals are. And if its goals in Rojava are to provide security and autonomy for Kurds and Arabs and others living in that region under its control, it will focus on that and try not to be diverted by other issues and to take whatever hit may come along because of that.
And I think for Iranians also, Afrin could be, if Turkey gets bogged down in Afrin, this is a perfect scenario for Iranians. Because first the regime, after Turkey launched the incursion, the regime allowed the YPG in the east, northeast Syria, to send reinforcements to Afrin through the territory that it controls. And recently, pro-Iran militias attacked a Turkish convoy in Idlib, in Aleppo. So I think what Iran and the regime would like to do, and I think that also it shows how complicated the relationship between Russia, Iran, and the regime. Also, maybe Russia doesn't have that much leverage over Iran and the regime. So Turkey decided to deploy observation points in Idlib and send a convoy. So apparently that happened as part of the de-escalation agreement. So it was Russia allowed Turkey to do that. But then the regime forces and the Iranian forces attacked the Turkish convoy. Because I think what Turkey was trying to do there also trying to prevent Iran and the regime to support the YPG in Afrin. So I think Iran and the regime would like to see a weakened YPG and a weakened Turkish military in Afrin. And that's why Iran is constantly shifting its position towards the YPG, because after the conflict started, just like the regime, it turned a blind eye to whatever YPG was doing in the north. And then the YPG and Americans got too close, and Iranians were very anxious about that. So they changed their tune. And now, again, the Turks are in Afrin, and Iran is now playing a double game. The question about Meral Akşener and closing down Incirlik, I don't think she's alone. I think both people in government circles and your opposition, they've been asking the government to close down Incirlik, but it's not an easy decision. And I don't think it will come to that, because it's one of the very few leverages that Turkey has over Washington. And it didn't even happen, even right after 1964 Johnson letter, and that was, I think, the first low point in Turkey-U.S. relations. So even then, Turkey did not close down Incirlik air base. Closed down other air bases, but not Incirlik. So I don't think, yes, people are saying that isn't it time to close down Incirlik? The U.S. is supplying the YPG using Incirlik air base, so why do we still allow the U.S. To use the air base? That puts the government in a difficult spot. Although Erdogan used the Incirlik card for a long time, but I don't think he will do that, because that will cost him an important and one of the very few leverages that he has over.
And let's not forget Kürecik, Malatya Kürecik. He has actually talked about shutting that down. And that's very important. If you're doing anti-Iran stuff, that's terribly important.
Right, okay. I'll take, I have to give this one to Deniz, please in the front here.
Thank you, Merve. I'm Deniz. I'm an intern at the Turkey program here. And my question was, could you comment a little bit on the situation facing young people in Turkey in the context of how Turkey has internalized basically its conflict with Rojava and the surge in nationalism and the tense political environment that goes along with that?
I think we can think of it also in the context of the HDP and the new nationalist narrative that is being built around the Afrin operation and Turkey's neighbors in Syria here.
I mean, I think it's in some ways it's a difficult question, because obviously you're talking about a huge population. The youth in Turkey span everything from nationalists who support Erdogan to Kurdish youth who don't support what's happening. I think you'd have to break it down in terms of the sort of activism level of people. For young people who want to be active and are interested in democratic movements or other sorts of things, it's a very difficult time. Clearly, I mean, as Gonul pointed out, just speaking out, criticizing the war is reason for arrest. So, I mean, I happen to personally know many young people, I'm sure they do too, who have left the country and moved on.
I wonder what the percentage of 16-year-olds is in the Turkey overall population, because they've not experienced anything other than AKP rule.
Right, so it's
very apolitical.
And so I think there's a real sort of tectonic change occurring in Turkey that me, old lady, can't grasp really anymore.
I think they lost their faith in peaceful change. They don't. At some point I was teaching at the Turkish university teaching, well, my students were 19, 20-year-olds, and they're not political, they're not interested in politics. They are very opinionated, but they don't follow politics. They don't think change is possible because, as Amberin said, they don't know much. The only thing that they know is Erdogan, and he's been there forever. So
and
they
it's
don't
so
think it's
polarized, as we've seen in recent studies. The Kadir Has University, it's terrifying. But what I can say about the change I observe in Kurdish youth, because I sort of interact with them as a result of Twitter, among other things, is that more fewer and fewer of them see any common future with Turks inside Turkey. And what I hear very often is, oh, great, I hope Erdogan stays. I hope he really ruins the country. I hope that he just totally destroys it, so then, we can go our own way that much more, with that much more ease. And maybe even America will come and invade, or not invade, come and liberate, as they see it, the southeast. That's what they're thinking.
And I think also identity, going back to that Kadir Has University, the poll that they conducted, it's identity politics is very important. It's always been important, but I think it's even more important now. And I think my explanation is that in societies like Turkey, where institutions are not strong, there's just nowhere else to turn other than family and kinship ties, ethnic ties, so that just hardens the ethnic lines. And of course, that's very dangerous.
Thank you for all that. Okay, we'll take another question from this side. And please don't forget to introduce yourself.
Thank you. My name is Valentin Guru. I'm a diplomat with the Embassy of Romania. And my question is for the entire panel. What political lessons do you think that the Syrian Kurds might have learned after the insurgencies in southeastern Turkey and the independence referendum in northern Iraq, if any? Thanks.
I mean, that's, well, certainly from the referendum in Iraq and the U.S.'s sort of refusal to back or somehow act on behalf of the Iraqi Kurds and the conflict that erupted in Kirkuk and other places. I think they take a lesson of to trust in themselves, really. But I think actually for the PKK and also for the YPG, that has been a long-standing understanding. I don't think they actually learned that differently from the experience in Iraqi Kurdistan. On the insurgency, it's interesting. I mean, you could argue that that the PKK thought, based on their experiences, the YPG's experiences in Rojava, that they would be more successful in the urban battles that were launched in 2015, and that, of course, proved not to be true. So I'm not sure they learn anything back. The YPG now is, very experienced in Rojava and getting training and support from the Americans, which is a lot more than, anything they can really learn on the ground. And besides, since the failed urban battles in 2015, the PKK has moved back into kind of classic guerrilla warfare in the mountains, and that just doesn't match with the terrain in Syria.
But I think the lesson they've drawn from all of that is that that what they've realized is they've underestimated the degree to which Turkey is prepared to crush them,
Yes.
both during the 2015 urban battles and now as we're witnessing in
exactly.
Afrin.
Thank you. Okay, we'll have this question.
Claire Lopez with the Center for Security Policy. Maybe this might be a good sum-up kind of a question for the panel. As we're looking at Turkey and statements from some of its senior officials, most recently, I think it might have been the foreign minister, talked about the invasion into the Afrin region as jihad against the Kurds. And perhaps as much as a year ago, we heard another senior official talk about re-establishing a dominance over former Ottoman territories, namely in the Balkans. We know that the AK party and Erdogan are allied closely with Hamas, the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. We know that the AK party is directly working with the U.S. Muslim Brotherhood in this country. To what extent, and this is the strategic look, if you'll back off a bit, to what extent are we looking at something larger? Perhaps the reemergence of a kind of a neo-Ottoman jihad state in Turkey?
I mean, I think there's a lot of questions about some of your premises. First of all, some of your statements. I have to say that. I mean, I wouldn't begin to agree with a lot of that, but then I will turn it over to some of my colleagues on that.
I don't recall Çavuşoğlu ever talking about a jihad against the Kurds. In fact, the president has repeatedly said that this is not against the Kurds, it's against the terrorists, meaning the PKK and sort of...
That's why they named it
Olive Branch. And by the way, trade relations with Israel are booming for this country that, you know, is supposed to be the...
Correct.
And look at Turkey's, I mean, if you're curious about what Turkey can do in the region as a neo-Ottoman power, just look where Turkey is in the region. The terrible relations with Egypt, used to be close allies with the Saudis, and now there's tension between the Saudis and Turkey, tension with the Gulf countries, Iranian, UAE especially, pro-Iranian forces are attacking Turkish troops, although they become close partners in Syria. So Turkey, I think, is nowhere close to where it was in 2009, and that was when more people in the region talked about the neo-Ottoman agenda. I don't think that's the case anymore.
Well, there was of course, the problem of Turkey getting involved with the Syrian opposition, and there were many reports and concerns coming out of the United States about Turkey's actions helping ISIS grow in northern Syria. There's also Turkey's cooperation with various jihadist groups all over the region. So it's not that clear of a picture. As you know,
the United States cooperated with jihadi groups in Afghanistan. I mean,
right.
Yeah, I mean, that's still a jump from some of the claims, though.
Well, yes. I mean, I'm just saying that there are problems between Turkey and the United States, and there's a reason why we called this panel Turkey in between the U.S. between Turkey and the Kurds in Syria, because while of course it's not as black and white as having a choice between partnering with the YPG versus NATO-ally Turkey, and I think we've addressed this point before, but it also we can't ignore the fact that Turkey's yeah that's a nice way to put it. Could we take...
And the wife is getting really angry.
I think she was angry, always. We'll take a question in the back.
Hi, I'm Farhad Pouladi with the Voice of America Persian Service. And my question is directed to Ms. Zaman and Ms. Marcus. Since you mentioned Iran as a player in Syria, I wanted to know what's your take on the U.S. effort should be concentrating in order to curb Iran's influence in the Syrian conflict?
It's a really hard question, I have to tell you, given everything that's going on now. And I'll actually, I don't have any advice on that, or, but I have a yes.
Well, I think even for Russia, it's difficult to curb Iranian influence in Syria, because if the U.S. is not willing to put boots on the ground, Iran, if you talk about Iranian influence in Iraq, it's a different matter. They have, it's not just the militias that they support or the weapons that they send. They have a strong soft power presence in Iraq. That's not the case in Syria. In Syria, I think what makes Iran a very important actor is the fact that they logistically support the regime. They have troops on the ground, and they support militias. So that's the key. And if you don't counter that, you cannot curb Iran.
I think the other part of that is that in Iraq, the United States has formal relations with the government, and is indeed considers Mr. Abadi as a very close ally and perhaps somebody who can help them counter Iranian influence. The United States has no formal ties with the Assad regime, and I think that makes everything a lot more complicated in terms of exercising its influence, even if it's to promote, say, Kurdish rights or sort of, help the Kurds get some kind of recognition. How do you do that in the absence of a relationship with this admittedly horrible regime?
I think we have time for the last few questions, so I want to get the room for that. We'll take a question here.
Colin Winston, APAC. I know that there are a lot of political variables go into determining whether or not an organization is listed as a terrorist one or not. PKK is listed as a terrorist group. The YPG is not. But I would like the panel to look at what goes on the ground, how these groups fight. Do they target innocent civilians? Is there any real justification from that angle for listing the PKK as a terrorist group? The YPG is not. Should they both be terrorist groups? Neither be terrorist groups?
Look, when the PKK was formally listed, when the list came out, I think sometime after 9/11, I mean, there were lots of reasons to include it, not least of all close U.S. relations with Turkey, which saw it as a terrorist group, and the U.S. was obviously sympathetic to its allies who felt that they were facing terrorism. Whether does the PKK target civilians? You'd have to look. Sort of historically, there were times when civilians were killed. Now, the PKK would argue they weren't always civilians. They were village guards. They were paid by Turkey to fight against the PKK, or they were accidentally killed along the way. But for Turkey, it's enough that its police have been targeted, that civilians have died in some bombings, whether the PKK was targeting them or not. And it's enough that the organization took up arms in urban centers to reinforce the idea for Turkey that they deserve to be on a terrorism list. And given the relations between Turkey and the United States, it's hard to imagine that the United States would at some point, or immediately right now, remove the PKK from the list. And for the YPG, obviously, it's a different fight. They haven't been targeting Turkish civilians. They haven't targeted civilians inside Syria, although the Kurdish opposition will argue that some of their members, Kurdish groups that are in opposition to the YPG in Syria, will argue and give examples of their members who have been unlawfully arrested or sent into exile. In some cases, they claim murdered. So, but that's not something I think that really has concerned the United States. And at this point, of course, the United States can't put the needs to continue to see this as much of a distinction. So,
but setting aside the label, the fact remains that Turkey has this very big problem with the Kurds that it must solve, and at some point it, I think, came to that realization and began talking to the PKK, and at some point they're going to have to do that again. It's inevitable if they want Turkey to prosper, to become, a full-fledged democracy.
I think that's a great note to end on, actually, and also I'm getting the signals that we need to end. So, thank you all for coming. Thank you for your remarks and for explaining the